There's no denying that Mephiles the Dark is one evil guy, whether you find him to be too cliched or not. But one thing I actually wonder, would Mephiles have turned out the way he was if Shadow hadn't imprisoned him? My name is Lord Danny, and today we'll be discussing if Shadow the Hedgehog turned Mephiles the Dark evil.
Mephiles time.
Okay, the time travel logic in Sonic 06 is flawed, but time travel is always going to have problems. But going by the game's implied logic, we understand that things are pretty much set in stone. Shadow would inevitably be the one to trap Mephiles, because when Mephiles first met Shadow, he remembered being imprisoned by him 10 years prior. Iblis would eventually be released because Mephiles would kill Sonic. Sonic would meet Silver in his own timeline because Silver would come from a destroyed future in an attempt to kill him. It doesn't make sense to believe in this strange loop, but this is the logic we are working with. So let's put our focus onto Mephiles the Dark. When Shadow first meets him, Mephiles hates him. He actually intends to exact revenge on Shadow for making him suffer for 10 years. Obviously, Shadow isn't aware of this, because he hasn't yet travelled back in time to trap Mephiles. But when Shadow does that, that is when Mephiles sees him for the first time. If we take a moment to look at this from Mephiles' perspective, Mephiles is a creature who has just been born and escaped an experimental lab. He probably doesn't even know his own name. In fact, Shadow is probably the one who unintentionally named him by calling him Mephiles when he chased him down. It doesn't take long for Shadow to attack Mephiles, who isn't actually that powerful, and he traps him inside the Scepter of Darkness, where Mephiles remains for 10 years. If some stranger I had technically never met decided to grab me and shove me into a small container when I literally did nothing wrong except exist, then I would be pretty angry too. Now then, obviously there's more to it than this. I can already hear people saying,
"But Danny, Mephiles told Shadow that he would die and kept threatening him with death before he was sealed."
And yes, he did. He was threatening to kill Shadow while Shadow was imprisoning him. Again, this guy is being shoved into a tiny vessel when he hasn't done anything wrong. I know what the next thing is.
Danny, the lab exploded because he made the experiment go wrong. He killed Elise's father and caused her to host Iblis' spirit in her body.
Well, no. There are actually a few things here regarding the lab experiment. Solaris was something known as a flame of hope, and with it someone could control time if it evolved or something. It was never made clear. The Duke of Soliana seemed to be working on creating a living creature using the flame of hope. He seemed to be trying to create a god. Now, people are confused as to whether or not Solaris is the same as the Solaris from Soliana mythology, and I personally don't think it's the same one. I think the Solaris from the lab is no different to something like the Bio Lizard or Shadow the Hedgehog, but it's named after the god they believed in as a way of showing respect. The experiment was a disaster, and because of that, the creature was split into two halves: Mephiles, the mind and conscience, and Iblis, the brute force of destruction. If the Solaris god was actually real, perhaps this is something to be blamed on it, because, as many know, in most mythologies and religions, gods do not like false recreations of them and will punish those who attempt to imitate them. So no doubt the real Solaris god is behind the experiment's failure. If you remember what happened after the accident, both halves of Solaris split off to flee the scene down different paths. Silver chased down Iblis while Shadow chased down Mephiles. If Mephiles had malicious intent and wanted to seek reunion with Iblis, then why didn't he follow him? Why did they not fuse back together immediately? It seemed more like they were both just trying to flee. Iblis obviously has no mind of his own, so was just going anywhere, but Mephiles, being the intelligent half, didn't stay by him. He just decided that he had to get out of the lab somehow, and when Shadow came after him, he could only keep on going until he was cornered. Mephiles even begged Shadow to stop when Shadow was sealing him away. So then, now the question remains, what if Shadow hadn't actually done anything to Mephiles? Well, in truth, it's kind of hard to say. There are many things that could have happened. Assuming that Mephiles was evil either way, then he probably would have searched for Iblis and reunited with him. That's the obvious answer. But we like to get creative on this channel, don't we? Let's take Mephiles as a being who has only just discovered freedom. he is perfectly intelligent, but he has never been free. So if he had managed to avoid Shadow and Silver, or if they weren't there to intervene at all, then he would be able to think about leaving the underwater lab to head to the surface. The problem is, Mephiles is liquid in his natural form, so he would need to create a solid form. He could obviously use one of the dead researchers as a reference, but instead, I'm just going to go ahead and use this as Mephiles' non-shadow form. If you don't know who this is Null. They were going to be a character in the later Archie comic issues, but the comics were cancelled before this character could get much development. The resemblance between Null and Mephiles is deliberate and very noticeable, so we're going to use Null's form as Mephiles' solid form. Mephiles would have eventually found a way out of the lab, and maybe even knew the way out immediately because this is the facility he was born in. It wouldn't be surprising to find that he had actually seen other rooms when he was being transported from place to place, considering the fact that it looks like the Flame of Hope was originally in the Soliana castle. Okay, so before I continue, here's the question. Would Mephiles have saved Elise, or would he have just left without bringing her with him? Of course, saving Elise wouldn't be out of character because this version of Mephiles isn't the same one we see throughout Sonic 06, but I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that he left it behind. Just so the plot doesn't get too different and confusing, let's assume that one of the surviving researchers, or the Duke himself, sealed Iblis inside of Elise. Or maybe even Silver did it, since he and Shadow might have still ended up there. After escaping, Mephiles would be free to do anything. His story could literally go anywhere. Maybe he went out into the world and people saw him as a devil, so targeted him. Maybe he became one of those misunderstood villains like Chaos. Maybe he eventually decided that he had to reunite with Iblis for some reason. One person actually commented on one of my videos that Mephiles might see Iblis as a beloved sibling, so reuniting with him and becoming Solaris would be like reuniting with a long-lost beloved family member. If I can find the comments, I'll put it on screen, but if not, just know that this isn't my idea. I'm just mentioning it because it's a nice way of looking at this dynamic between Mephiles and Iblis, especially in this hypothetical scenario. But let's add a little hot sauce to this. There are honestly too many ideas for an escaped Mephiles, so here's the hot sauce. Shadow and Silver. Let's say that they actually were there, but perhaps Shadow had never met Mephiles in the future. Instead, he and Silver were sent to the past by accident, maybe in Eggman's weird time machine thing or something. They have no idea what's going on, and when they encounter the new-bodied Mephiles, they don't know what to do. They prepare to fight, thinking he caused the accident, and Mephiles would likely fight back defensively because at this stage, we know that he isn't as powerful as he later becomes. Everyone eventually grows tired out, and Shadow is the one to ask Mephiles who he is. Mephiles probably does know his name, but if not, considering that there is still the theory that Shadow named him by mistake, then we can just think of this version of Mephiles as Null. Mephiles/Null will explain what happened, and that's when the three will notice Elise. The Duke is obviously still alive, so that he can seal Iblis into his daughter, and he'd obviously be terrified of Mephiles/Null because he'd see him as an abomination. A mistake. Mephiles/Null would point out, okay, I'm gonna just call him Null from now on. Null would point out that the Duke created him, perhaps with some form of a newborn innocence, but obviously the Duke is disgusted. Still, things go on as they did in Sonic 06. Iblis is sealed away into Elise's body, and Null probably doesn't know of his own potential to become Solaris yet, which is why he has no interest in fusing with his other half. The Duke then dies of his wounds, and everyone leaves the lab. Shadow and Silver must search for a way back to their own time, and maybe, just maybe, Null is their solution. He might travel to the future with them using his newly discovered time travel powers, skipping 10 years of his own life because there was nothing he was living for in the past. Now, from there, Null could still take a dark turn. He might feel the force within the now grown Elise growing stronger, and might desire to reunite with it, but maybe it's a feeling he wants to resist. Maybe he's completely against becoming the very thing the Duke wanted him to be. Maybe Null, or Mephiles, just wanted to be normal. It's still possible for him to be corrupted by his own powers, and maybe he would make dark choices throughout his life. He might even be the one to kill the Duke as part of a revenge plan, but that would make him more like an anti-hero or maybe a chaotic neutral force. He does things, but sometimes he chooses to do something seen as good or right, while other things he does are seen as wrong or bad. Either way, he's putting himself first. Overall, with the many ideas that keep popping into my head as I write this, Mephiles seems like someone who would become more of a strange lone force, and it's really hard to tell where his character would have gone if it weren't for Shadow's influence on him. But to conclude, let's take it back to the original question. Did Shadow make Mephiles evil? Well, possibly yes. I think that Mephiles gained his devil-like name from Shadow himself, so it's not like he was inherently bad because of his name. As for the dark part of his name, he was sealed in the Scepter of Darkness. He spent 10 years in there with nothing to do, no one to talk to. He most likely went a little bit insane, and the people who knew about the scepter chose to hide it with magic. They were purposefully shunning him and keeping him in the dark. Of course he would begin to see himself as someone who was evil and dark, because that's what everyone told him he was, and they treated him as such despite him not doing anything at all. Remember that one scene in Zootopia where Nick Wilde explains his childhood trauma to Judy, stating that he believed that if the world will only see a sly, shifty fox, then why try to be anything else? I think that analogy perfectly fits Mephiles. He was isolated and condemned for just being what people thought he was. Nobody dared to release him because of what terror he could bring, but the truth is, there was no terror at all. Just the rumours about the Solaris incident, which went around town. He was never actually judged based on his own actions, because by the time he was sealed, he hadn't done anything but try to escape the lab. But because Shadow sealed Mephiles away, Mephiles became instantly consumed with a desire for revenge, and knew that he had to become stronger. How would he become stronger? By reuniting with his other half, Iblis, to become the very thing the Duke wanted him to become all those years ago. The very thing he actually seemed to not want to become at all, since he split from Iblis and fled the scene of the accident. Mephiles became evil by nurture, not by nature. He had no experience with life at all, so when he escaped his prison, he had no problem with destroying anyone in his way or emotionally manipulating those around him. He didn't care. His whole life, nobody cared about him. Nobody freed him willingly. Everyone wanted to keep him sealed and hidden away so that he could be trapped forever. He had no way of ever learning to care or love, because there was nothing for him to care for or love. Perhaps if he hadn't been sealed away, then he would have experienced the world. And he may have seen that he didn't want to become such a destructive force when he learned that some things were worth living for other than one's own life. And there you have it. A discussion about how Shadow most likely turned Mephiles evil. It's an idea I haven't seen many talk about, so I hope you guys are interested in what I've had to say about this little theory of mine. What do you guys think? I didn't go into much detail about what Mephiles' alternate story could be, so if you want, you guys can go in the comments and come up with your own ideas. I want to see what you guys can come up with for our beloved Dark Blob. Also, if you're new, don't forget to subscribe and follow me on Twitter, and maybe join the squad hideout we have on Discord. This has been Lord Danny, and I am signing out.